Following Caitlin's emergence last year, Linda Thompson is now sharing her recollections.
You know, pop history kind of in my relationship with Elvis and Bruce's truth.
For 50 years, Linda Thompson kept a promise to Elvis to keep a secret so heavy. Now, at 76, she is finally ready to speak about the nights he whispered his deepest fears. The truth she swore to hide forever. What was Elvis so afraid of? What did he beg Linda never to tell? Join us as we uncover the haunting truth behind the King's golden smile. A silence that felt like fear. For almost 50 years, Linda Thompson carried a weight that pressed against her chest every time someone mentioned his name. And that name was everywhere, on radio stations and movie screens, and in the whispers of fans who still gathered at Graceland's gates long after he was gone. She had loved him, lived with him, held him through nights when sleep refused to come. And in those quiet hours between darkness and dawn, he had told her things that made her pulse quicken and her hands go cold. These were not stories about fame or music or the roar of stadium crowds. These were confessions wrapped in paranoia and sealed with a plea that she never imagined would haunt her for decades to come. Linda was not a woman who craved attention. She had spent years in the shadow of the most famous man on earth and learned quickly that silence was safer than truth, especially when that truth involved fear so deep it could swallow a legend whole. Elvis had looked at her with eyes that no longer sparkled the way they did on stage. Eyes that darted toward doors and windows as if expecting something terrible to walk through at any moment. And he had whispered words that felt like secrets too dangerous to repeat. He made her promise, not once but many times, that she would protect what he was about to share. And the way he gripped her hand when he said it told her this was not a game or a moment of melodrama. This was real terror dressed in the skin of a king. The years passed and Linda moved on with her life. She married and divorced and built a career of her own, but the secret stayed lodged in her memory like a splinter she could never remove. She watched documentaries and read books and listened to experts dissect every moment of his existence. Yet none of them knew what she knew. None of them had seen the man who checked under beds and behind curtains, who spoke in hushed tones about forces he believed were circling him like wolves. The world wanted to remember Elvis as untouchable, a god in jeweled jumpsuits who commanded love and devotion from millions. But Linda remembered a man who felt hunted, watched, and utterly alone despite being surrounded by people every single day of his life. Now at 76, with more years behind her than ahead, Linda decided the silence had lasted long enough. Not because she wanted revenge or fame or money, but because the truth deserved to breathe, even if it shattered the myth the world had built around a man who could never escape his own shadow. The Elvis no cameras ever caught. The world knew Elvis Presley as a force of nature, a man whose hips could start riots and whose voice could make grown women weep. But Linda Thompson knew a different man entirely, one who existed only behind locked doors and drawn curtains, where the public's hungry eyes could not reach. This Elvis did not wear leather or sequins. He wore exhaustion like a second skin, and when he moved through the rooms of Graceland, it was with the careful steps of someone who believed the ground beneath him might give way at any moment. He was gentle with Linda in ways that surprised her, touching her face with hands that trembled slightly, speaking to her in a voice so soft she sometimes had to lean in close to hear him. And in those moments, she understood that the swagger and confidence he displayed on stage were costumes he could no longer take off, even when the lights went dark. Elvis watched people the way a hunted animal watches the forest, his gaze sharp and calculating, always measuring who could be trusted and who might be waiting to betray him. Linda noticed how he would pause mid-conversation if someone new entered the room, how his body would stiffen and his smile would freeze into something that looked real but felt hollow. And she realized that for him, every interaction was a performance, every word a potential trap. He questioned things that seemed harmless to her, wondering aloud why a phone call had come at a particular time, why a delivery man had lingered near the gate, why a room felt different than it had the day before. And though she tried to reassure him that these were ordinary occurrences in an ordinary world, she could see in his eyes that he no longer believed in ordinary. This was not the fearless star whose posters hung in bedrooms across America. This was a man who had learned to fear his own fame, who understood that being loved by millions also meant being watched by millions, and that somewhere in that vast sea of adoration, there might be people who wished him harm. Linda saw how carefully he controlled his environment, how he needed to know where everyone was at all times, how he checked locks and windows before allowing himself to relax. And even then, relaxation never truly came. He carried tension in his shoulders and worry in the lines around his mouth. And when he smiled for her, it was beautiful but brief, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds before vanishing again. The man Linda knew was not weak or broken, but he was weary in a way that sleep could never fix, burdened by a paranoia that had roots in something real or imagined. She could never be entirely sure which, and perhaps neither could he. Living under watch. Elvis believed someone was always listening, always watching, always waiting for him to slip up and reveal something he should not. Linda saw this belief take root in him, like a disease that spread slowly through his mind, until every corner of his world felt contaminated with suspicion and doubt. He would pick up the telephone and then set it down again, without dialing, convinced that the line was tapped and that strangers in dark rooms were recording every word he spoke. She watched him study the faces of people who had worked for him for years, searching for signs of betrayal in their eyes, questioning their loyalty, even when they had given him no reason to doubt. Strangers made him especially nervous. Delivery men and repair workers, and anyone whose presence at Graceland had not been scheduled days in advance. And he would find reasons to leave the room when they arrived, as if proximity to them might somehow put him in danger. There were moments when Elvis would be talking to Linda about something ordinary, a song he wanted to record or a movie he had watched. And then suddenly, he would stop mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into silence as his eyes darted around the room. She learned not to ask what was wrong, because he would not tell her. Or perhaps he could not find the words to explain the feeling that had just washed over him, that sense that invisible forces were closing in. Privacy became something Elvis mourned like a lost friend. He spoke about it the way people speak about childhood or innocence, as something that once existed but could never be reclaimed. He told Linda there was a time when he could walk down a street or sit in a diner or go to a movie without feeling like prey, but those days were gone and they were never coming back. The walls of Graceland were supposed to protect him, but instead they felt like the walls of a cage, keeping the world out but also keeping him trapped inside with his own spiraling thoughts. Linda tried to comfort him, tried to convince him that not everyone was an enemy, that some people simply loved him and wanted nothing in return, but her words seemed to bounce off the hard shell of fear he had built around himself. He whispered more than he spoke during those later years, his voice dropping to barely audible levels, as if he believed that speaking too loudly would alert whoever was listening to his location. Linda found herself whispering back without meaning to, caught up in the same paranoia that had consumed the man she loved. And she wondered if this was what happened when you lived too long inside someone else's nightmare. You started to believe it was real. Nights without sleep. The nights were the worst because darkness amplified everything Elvis feared, turning shadows into threats and silence into something heavy and suffocating that pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Linda would lie beside him in bed and feel the tension radiating from his body, his muscles tight and his breathing shallow, and she knew that sleep would not come easily, or perhaps would not come at all. Elvis would stare at the ceiling for hours, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mind racing through scenarios that only he could see. She asked him once what he was thinking about, and he told her he was listening, waiting for sounds that did not belong, footsteps in hallways that should be empty, voices outside windows that should be silent. And though she heard nothing unusual, she understood that his fear was not about what was real, but about what might be real. Some nights he would get up and walk through Graceland room by room, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was locked and secure, and when he returned to bed, he would lie there rigid and alert, as if expecting an alarm to sound at any moment. Linda learned to stay awake with him, because being alone in his fear seemed crueler than sharing it, even though watching him suffer made her heart ache in ways she had never experienced before. Exhaustion became his constant companion, etched into the lines of his face and the heaviness of his movements, and she could see how it was slowly destroying him from the inside out. Sleep deprivation did strange things to the mind. It made fears seem more real and rational thoughts harder to hold on to, and Elvis was drowning in both. He told her once that fear felt louder in the dark, that all the worries he could push aside during daylight hours came rushing back when the sun went down and the world went quiet. The darkness gave his paranoia room to expand and twist into shapes that seemed monstrous and unstoppable. And Linda had no tools to fight monsters that existed only in his mind. She watched him sink deeper into a pattern where night became something to dread rather than a time to rest, and every sunrise brought only temporary relief before the cycle began again. The man who had once commanded stages and crowds now could not command his own thoughts, could not silence the voices in his head that told him danger was everywhere, and trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Fame. As a cage. Elvis told Linda that fame had turned his life into a prison where the bars were made of cameras and microphones and the millions of eyes that watched his every move. He said it with a sadness that made her want to cry. This man who had everything the world could offer, but felt like he had nothing that truly belonged to him anymore. He could not walk down a street without being mobbed, could not eat in a restaurant without people staring and whispering and asking for autographs, could not exist as a normal human being. Because normal had been stolen from him the moment he became a star. Linda saw how this truth ate away at him, how he longed for simple things that other people took for granted, like privacy and anonymity and the freedom to make mistakes without the world watching and judging. Every move he made was documented and analyzed. Every word he spoke was repeated and twisted. And every mistake was magnified and thrown back at him by critics and tabloids who seemed to take pleasure in his failures. The pressure to be perfect was crushing him. Linda could see it in the way his shoulders sagged and his smile faltered when he thought no one was looking. Fame had promised him the world, but delivered a cage. And the worst part was that the cage was invisible, so people on the outside could not understand why he was not happy. They saw the mansion and the cars and the money, and they assumed he had everything. But Linda knew that what he had was a life where he could never truly relax, never truly trust, never truly be himself. Elvis spoke about the early days sometimes, when fame was new and exciting and felt like a gift rather than a curse. But those memories seemed distant and faded like photographs left too long in the sun. Now, fame felt like a weight that grew heavier every year, pushing him down into a darkness he could not escape. The irony was not lost on Linda, that the thing he had worked so hard to achieve had become the thing that destroyed his peace of mind. He had wanted to be loved and admired and remembered. And he had gotten all of that, but the cost was his sanity and his sense of safety, and his ability to live without fear. She watched him struggle against the invisible bars of his fame, searching for exits that did not exist. And she understood that for Elvis, there would be no escape, not while he was alive. The FBI secret Elvis told Linda something that sounded impossible. Something that made her question whether the paranoia had finally crossed into territory where reality and delusion became impossible to separate. He claimed he was working with the FBI, that he was sharing information with them and receiving protection in return, and the way he said it left no room for doubt or discussion. There was no proof of this arrangement, no documents or phone calls or official visits that Linda ever witnessed. But Elvis believed it with a certainty that was both frightening and sad. He spoke about it in whispers late at night, telling her that he was helping his country, that he was more than just an entertainer, that he had a higher purpose that the public would never understand. This belief shaped everything about how he saw the world around him. It explained why he felt watched, because in his mind he was being watched. It justified his paranoia, because if he was truly working with federal agents, then enemies would be everywhere. Linda did not know if she should believe him or worry about him, if this was truth or the fantasy of a man desperate to feel important again. The FBI story gave Elvis something he desperately needed. It made him feel like he mattered in ways that went beyond music and movies and screaming fans. He had been the biggest star in the world, but stars eventually fade, and perhaps this secret mission, real or imagined, was his way of holding on to relevance and purpose when both seemed to be slipping away. Linda watched him cling to this belief like a drowning man clings to driftwood, and she understood that challenging it would be cruel because it was one of the few things that still made him feel powerful in a life where he increasingly felt powerless. Whether the FBI connection was real became less important than what it represented. A lifeline to a version of himself that still had value and meaning. But the belief also fed his darker impulses. It reinforced the idea that hidden forces were everywhere, that surveillance was constant, that trust was impossible. The FBI's secret, true or not, became the foundation upon which all his other fears were built. and Linda saw how it twisted his perception until he could no longer tell friend from enemy or safety from danger. She never found evidence to support his claims, but she also never found evidence to definitively disprove them, and so she existed in that uncertain space where love and doubt lived side by side. Why he needed to believe it. The FBI story was not just a claim Elvis made, it was a need he had, a psychological anchor that kept him from drifting completely into the darkness that threatened to consume him. Linda understood this even if she could not prove whether his claims were real. She saw how the belief transformed him from a fading entertainer into someone who still had importance and agency in a world that increasingly made him feel irrelevant. Elvis had spent decades being worshipped and adored, having his every wish granted and his every whim indulged. But worship is a strange and empty thing when it comes from strangers who love an image rather than a person. The FBI connection, whether real or imagined, gave him a sense of purpose that went beyond performing, beyond being looked at and screamed for, and reduced to a product that people consumed. Linda saw how his eyes would light up when he talked about it, how his voice would gain strength and conviction, how for those moments he seemed less afraid and more in control. The belief made him feel like he was contributing something meaningful, like he was protecting his country and serving a cause greater than himself. And perhaps that was worth more to him than truth. But the need to believe it also revealed how far he had fallen from the confident young man who had revolutionized music and culture. It showed how desperately he was searching for validation and meaning in a life that had become hollow despite all its glitter and gold. The FBI story filled a void that fame could not fill. It gave him identity beyond celebrity and purpose beyond entertainment. Linda also recognized that this belief fed directly into his paranoia. It created a framework where being watched and followed and listened to made perfect sense. If he was working with federal agents, then of course there would be surveillance. Of course there would be people who wanted to know what he knew. Of course danger would lurk in unexpected places. The tragedy was that whether true or false, the belief made his life harder rather than easier. It intensified his isolation and deepened his mistrust and gave his fears a structure they might not otherwise have had. Linda wanted to shake him and tell him to let it go. But she also understood that letting it go might mean losing the last thing that made him feel like Elvis Presley still mattered. Trust was rare. Elvis trusted almost no one, and even those he did trust were held at a distance that kept them from ever truly knowing him completely. Linda was one of the few who broke through that barrier, but even she felt the weight of constant testing. The sense that loyalty had to be proven again and again, because yesterday's devotion meant nothing today. He surrounded himself with people but kept them at arm's length emotionally, creating a world where he was never truly alone, but never truly connected either. The Memphis Mafia, his employees, his family, they all orbited around him like planets around a sun, close enough to feel his warmth, but never close enough to touch the core of who he really was. Linda watched him test people in small ways and large, asking questions designed to catch them in lies, setting up situations to see if they would betray him, examining their reactions to gauge whether their love was real or purchased. Trust for Elvis was not freely given. It had to be earned through trials that most people did not even know they were taking. Control became his primary method of maintaining whatever fragile sense of security he could manufacture. He needed to know where everyone was, what they were doing, who they were talking to. Losing control over any aspect of his environment sent him spiraling into anxiety and suspicion, and Linda learned that spontaneity and surprise were enemies to a man who needed everything planned and predictable. She saw how exhausting it was for him to live this way, constantly vigilant, constantly measuring, constantly afraid that the people closest to him might turn into his greatest threats. The irony was that his inability to trust probably created the very distance and resentment he feared, pushing people away even as he desperately needed them close. Terror lived in Elvis whenever he felt control slipping, when someone acted unexpectedly, or when circumstances moved beyond his ability to manage them. And in those moments, Linda saw a man who was utterly vulnerable despite all his power and fame. Trust was the rarest commodity in his world, more precious than gold and infinitely more fragile. And he guarded it so fiercely that he almost ensured it would never truly exist. The secret he begged her to keep. Elvis made Linda promise something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. He begged her to protect his image no matter what she saw or heard or experienced behind the closed doors of Graceland. He gripped her hands with an intensity that bordered on desperation and told her that the world could never know about his fears, his doubts, his sleepless nights, or the paranoia that consumed him like a slow-burning fire. The legend mattered more than the man. He told her this repeatedly, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. Elvis Presley, the icon, had to remain untouchable, larger than life, perfect and powerful, and forever frozen in the minds of millions, as the king who never faltered or fell. What happened in private, the tears and the terror and the trembling hands, those things had to stay buried because revealing them would destroy everything he had built. Linda understood what he was asking of her. He wanted her to carry his secrets to the grave, to smile for cameras and tell stories about his generosity and charm, while hiding the truth about the man who checked under beds and whispered about government conspiracies. It was not a small request. It was asking her to participate in a carefully constructed lie that protected a myth at the expense of honesty. She agreed because she loved him, because refusing would have broken whatever fragile trust existed between them, and because she believed at the time that protecting him was the same as loving him. The weight of that promise settled onto her shoulders and never left. It traveled with her through marriages and careers and decades of watching the world worship a version of Elvis that bore little resemblance to the frightened man she had held in the darkness. Elvis did not want pity or understanding. He wanted admiration and reverence. He wanted to be remembered as invincible, even though he felt like the most vulnerable person in any room. The gap between who he was and who the world believed him to be grew wider every year, and Linda became one of the few people who stood in that gap and saw both sides clearly. He made her promise not once but many times, as if repetition would somehow make the secret more secure, and each time she promised, she felt a little piece of herself disappear into the silence he demanded. The truth was buried alive, and Linda became its keeper, a role she never asked for but could not escape. The truth that comes too late. At 76 years old, Linda Thompson finally broke the silence she had maintained for nearly half a century. And when she spoke, the words came slowly at first, weighted with years of carrying secrets that had grown heavier with time. She did not speak to accuse or betray. She was not interested in tearing down the legend that Elvis had worked so hard to protect. But she believed the world deserved to understand the full truth of who he was. The real tragedy was not that Elvis feared conspiracies or believed he was being watched. The tragedy was that a man surrounded by people every single day of his life felt utterly alone in ways that no amount of fame or money or adoration could fix. He lived in a prison built from his own mind, with bars made of paranoia and walls constructed from the inability to trust anyone completely. Linda spoke about the nights he could not sleep, the way he checked and rechecked locks, the whispered conversations about threats that may or may not have been real, and she did it not to diminish him, but to humanize him in ways the legend never allowed. Elvis was not just a voice or a face or a cultural icon. He was a deeply troubled man who needed help he never received, and understanding he was too proud to ask for. The secret he begged her to keep was never about fear, raw and consuming fear that no one around him knew how to stop or even fully acknowledge. Everyone enabled the paranoia, fed into it, or ignored it, and Elvis spiraled deeper into isolation while surrounded by crowds. Linda's revelation came too late to help Elvis, but perhaps not too late to change how the world understood mental health, fame, and the price people pay for living under constant scrutiny. She wanted people to know that behind every legend is a human being, fragile and flawed and deserving of compassion rather than worship. The truth she finally shared was both devastating and liberating. It shattered some illusions, but created space for a more honest understanding of a man who gave everything to his fans but could not save himself from the demons that lived inside his own head. Linda carried the weight of silence for decades, and in speaking she did not betray Elvis. She freed both of them from a promise that should never have been asked or given. Linda Thompson's revelation at 76 was not an act of betrayal, but an act of love, a final gift to a man who died believing his fears had to stay hidden forever. The secret Elvis guarded so desperately was simply this: he was human, terrified, and desperately alone, despite being surrounded by millions who adored him. His legend will always shine bright, but now the world knows the cost of that brilliance. A man who sacrificed his peace, his sleep, and his sanity to remain perfect in the eyes of those who never truly knew him. The truth has finally been told,